You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Here's your host, Ryan Argenta.
We're back with the Engage podcast. This is the Tentative Agreement series. Back with the negotiating chairman, Eric Criswell. Welcome back to the Engage podcast. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me here today.
We're talking about compensation, some of the sexier items that everybody wants to hear about. Eric, let's go for the pay rates. Let's talk about that.
So the opener, back when we first started this contract negotiation cycle back in 2019, said that we were aiming for industry-leading rates of pay on all aircraft types. The intent back at that time was to throw a wide net and say, hey, our pilots should be the best compensated, just period, without any other disclaimer on it. So primarily that's accomplished by the pay rate increases. We will be enjoying an 18% pay rate increase, retroactive to January 1st of 2023. Then it'll go up by another 5% a year later, January 1st of 24, and then 4% in January 1st of 25, and then another 4% in January 1st of 26. Now, the second piece of that, which is why that bullet in the opener was written the way it was, is that several of our aircraft types, when we compared to where they stack up on our pay table in comparison to the rest of the industry, we're paid at a substandard wage. So a great example of this is our wide body fleet of A330s and 767-400s. Other airlines have established a precedent to pay those at their top rate, which would also be applicable to an aircraft like a 777 or an A350. So this agreement also snaps our rates on the A330 and the 767-400 up to the top rate, currently only applicable to the 350. Coming into this contract, we've got about 6% of our pilots that have access to that top rate. And on data signing this contract, when all the rates become snapped up, 21% of our pilots will now have access to the top rate. And that percentage grows through the term of this agreement. We have deliveries coming on the A330s and A350s. So a larger percentage of our pilot group will end up at that top pay rate. I think it exceeds over a quarter of our pilot group by the end of this agreement will be at the top rate for their seat. The other one that was at a pretty significant disadvantage was the A320 and A319 rate. Anyone who's rode on that aircraft knows it's equivalent in most ways to the 737-800, but the pay rate was, for the captain scale anyway, was about $10 an hour less. So that's been fixed as well. Most other airlines pay those aircraft the same rate. So we got the A320 and 319 snapped up to match the 737-800 rate, just in recognition that they have the same seats, the same practical stage lengths, and the same mission types. The third one that was really at a disparity on our list, and this is one that we didn't really have good industry precedent on, was the A220. When this rate was negotiated during our last contract, there was an expectation that the aircraft Delta would receive from the manufacturer would have a gross weight limitation and were lower range aircraft than was originally advertised. Believe that the aircraft manufacturer talks about a 3,400 mile range on the A220. I was on the Horseshoe at the time, and we were briefed by the negotiators at the time that the company insisted that the aircraft we were taking only had a 12 to 1,500 mile range. So the pay rate was established based on that range and capability of the aircraft. Now, of course, the planes we got were obviously an unrestricted version. Suffice to say that we fixed it this time. So those aircraft are now going to pay the equivalent of what the old A320 and 319 rate were. So they've been snapped up for the 300 variant of the A220. The A220-100 is a difficult airplane to compare to. The industry aircraft with that number of seats really pays less than when we were already receiving on that aircraft. So it's a difficult airplane to move up on our pay table. But what we did do is we matched the slope of the A320, 319 rate that we had snapped the 220-300 up to. What that means is that throughout the longevity steps, the A220's original rate biased higher pay toward higher longevity, more so than the existing 320 rate did. So the practical effect of this is when you snap the slope of the 220-100 to the new slope of the 220-300, the early longevity steps end up with a disproportionate increase of between 1% and 2% throughout the pay step cycle. So it is a raise on the 220-100. It's just not reflected in the 12-year rate, but it's reflected in every other rate up the longevity table. So again, when we set out on this contract negotiation, it was what we believe are the highest rates of pay in any airline contract for these types of aircraft. And I believe that we've fulfilled that bullet on the opener.
Okay. Yeah, that was A lot to digest. I had a question about the 220-100, and you mentioned that slope. And really, that is the progression of the 220-100 through a 12-year career. That slope would be a little steeper. Is that a good way to think about that?
Yeah, actually, if you look at it on a graph, it's actually a little more shallow. So there's less variance between the first year longevity and the last year longevity with a shallower slope, which is actually good because that means that you've pushed the rate higher on the earlier longevity steps. So it ends up in the same spot, but it starts out at a higher spot and it stays higher throughout all those other longevity steps, just matching the slope. The 300 did move up, of course. It moved up a significant amount,
Right.
and that caused a pretty good bump on the 300, but we've snapped the slope up on the 100 as well, which also causes a pretty good bump for those pilots.
Okay. And Eric, tell me about the ER. Why were they not banded with anybody else?
So that one is a question we've actually gotten a lot. And the simple answer to that one is look around the industry. No one pays that aircraft at a higher band than we've already got. As a matter of fact, United splits the 757s into a lower rate than their ERs pay. So our band on the 757 and 767 is already consistent with the highest rates of pay in the industry on that aircraft type. And it's as simple as that. Of course, it was a conversation that we brought up the table. We proposed increases to that band, but at the end of the day, there wasn't a lot of industry precedent, especially in the context of mediated negotiations. We rely heavily on looking around and making a case based on pattern bargaining in the industry. And that one, the case just wasn't there.
Okay. So the RER rates 7576 are generally the industry leader anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Before this contract cycle and after this contract cycle, we pay ours as good as anyone else in the industry does. Like I say, our closest peer that still operates the airplane is United, and they actually pay the 757 a lower rate there than their ERs. American, of course, has a group 3 pay rate for these. However, they've retired the entire fleet, so it's not really an action on their list.
Okay. How about the ocean crossing override pay for narrow bodies? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a concept to wrap your head around. It's not just a straight override on day one of the contract, and it's not due to implementation that I say that. The way we've referred to this is really sucker insurance for the pilots. When we're taking these higher capability narrow body aircraft that could potentially cross oceans like the A321neo or the rumored 737 MAX that we may or may not be getting, those aircraft potentially could cross the ocean if we got the longest range versions of those aircraft. Now, Delta has stated publicly that it's really not their plan right now, not in their business plan to put those across the ocean. I don't know if they're going to or not. But if they do, we've established the rates based on the assumptions we've made for how they're going to be used in the network. If they go use these in international ocean crossing operations, we felt there needed to be some pay for that above and beyond an international override. So that's what this does. Of course, we've had legacy 757s crossing the ocean for decades, and that's an existing practice. So that particular aircraft, the 757, if we establish service that goes from, let's say, Boston to London on 757, that's not going to trigger this provision because that's something that Delta's been doing for quite some time. What triggers this provision is an aircraft like a 321neo starting new service from Boston to Dublin, which is realistically the only stage length that aircraft could potentially do. I'm hearing stories of some transcon flights in the neo that are having trouble just having enough gas to make a transcon flight. The one thing that doesn't count, our neos are currently doing Hawaii flying from the West Coast. So that does not trigger this either. So really, it's sucker insurance if we start sending next generation narrow bodies to Europe, which practically is the only place that they could utilize this way. Then this snap up actually goes to all aircraft that aren't on the top pay band. So it would then affect the ER in the 757 and the 737. Once one of those next generation narrow bodies starts going across the ocean, it triggers this for all aircraft, including wide body 767s that are doing ocean crossing flying. Again, it's probably a provision that is unlikely to pay, certainly in the short term or even medium term. It's really just sucker insurance if they use these aircraft in a way that we didn't anticipate when we established the rate.
Okay. So this is a forward-looking contract, and like you say, it's a sucker insurance. International pay remains the same. In fact, there's no increase to international pay as we currently know it, although it does now include Canada, right? Do you go to Canada?
Yeah, Canada's always been carved out of the international pay and the international per diem for that matter. And now Canada operations will also be included for international pay and per diem.
Okay, very good. I want to move on to the Me Too clause. A lot of questions about that. Let's get that out there. At first glance, it looks pretty robust. Walk me through what it is and then maybe an example that'll help us better understand it.
Sure. So our primary goal with that is we don't want to be limited. Some of the listeners might remember this summer when American pilots at APA came up with a potential contract proposal that ended up not really going anywhere. But one of the features that they had was a Me Too as well. However, it was limited. And I believe the limit on it was no greater than a 3% bump. So if Delta would have exceeded them by 5%, they would have only matched the first 3% of that. Our Me Too clause, the way that, again, was our priority was to not have a limit in place like that. So the way that it works is if either American or United, who are both in extended negotiations like we've been, if either one of them come up with a pay rate that exceeds our top band. So for instance, if United's 777 rate is established $15 an hour ahead of where our A350 rate is, our rates would then match that. So we'd get the $15 an hour bump. And then we would add another 1% based on whatever that number was. So it's not just whatever their percentage increase is plus a percent. It's actually we match their rate and then we get a percent on top of that. And there's some marginal compounding that happens there that's actually to our benefit. But the concept is we match that top rate and then we add a percent to whatever that is. Then we compare, okay, what is this new derivative rate that we have and what percentage increase did that represent? So maybe it's 4.2% after all that math is done. We take 4.2% and we add it to the rest of our pay table for all aircraft types and all rates. So that's how the Me Too works. It's based on the top rate, but it's applicable to all the other aircraft types. We could do that twice, once for United and once for American throughout this contract cycle. It does sunset at the amenable date. I don't think there's any expectation that they're going to still be in negotiations 4 years from now. So the likelihood is they're going to come to a deal. Whether they leapfrog our rates or not will remain to be seen. Industry pattern bargaining would seem to indicate that they will at least exceed our rates in some fashion. So there's pretty broad expectation that this Me Too clause will provide further raises beyond what's in our current agreement being considered.
Yeah. And I kind of want to run through that quickly again. So we're all paying attention to United. And if they come out and say, we've matched Delta's 18% pay raise, it's not based on their contractual pay increases.
So the nuance is we don't match their percentage. We actually match their rate. So if their rate is 15 actual dollars ahead of ours, we would snap our rate up to meet that. And then we would add a percent to that, whatever that is.
1% would be of the aggregate new rate.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just make the math easy. Our rate's starting out at 417 on the top pay banded aircraft. If they establish a rate of 430, we would snap our rate up to 430 and then add 1% from there.
So another $4.30.
That's exactly right.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Moving on to another fun one, holiday pay. It seems like pilots have been asking for it for a long time, and here it is. How does that work?
Yeah. So we have established 7 holidays. Of course, we wanted 30 holidays and the company wanted 0. We've established 7 holidays. That is equivalent to what the other employees at Delta get as well. But what happens on those 7 holidays is if you have any rotation that has any of its footprint that encroaches that holiday, you'll receive an extra ADG. Right now, that's 5 hours and 15 minutes of pay and no credit above all other pay that was due on that rotation. So first, I want to mention, why did we choose ADG and why did we not do what American did, which is we pay a 100% override on those days. We've talked to American quite a bit actually about this provision, and some regret they have is that on a lot of holidays, pilots don't have a lot of duty. So let's use Christmas as an example. You might report for a trip on the 23rd of December. That's a 5-day trip, and you might have a 30-hour layover on Christmas Day. And in that case at American, you would get no holiday for Christmas Day, even though you're on the road and you're in a hotel. So we chose to utilize the ADG and say, hey, I don't care if you're on a 30-hour layover or what, you're getting an ADG on that day. So in that example, you would have 2 holidays encompassed by that trip. You'd have Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So you'd be entitled to an extra 10 hours and 30 minutes on top of that trip. That would also include if it were paid at any of the premium steps of trip pay under a green slip or the new silver slip or a PVS premium rotation. That's a pre-month bid trip. And so this would stack on top of that as additional pay on top of your green slip or on top of your silver slip.
Okay. So it does stack in terms of if you hit both holidays or Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, you get the 515 twice. And then if you're on a green slip, you're already getting the premium pay. You get the 10.5 on top of the premium pay.
That's exactly right. So if that 4-day trip was worth 21 hours and you got it on a green slip, you're going to get 21 hours of pay and credit, just like you always do. Depending if you're a regular or reserve, you'll end up with the 21 hours times 2 for the green slip. So you end up with 42 hours as well as the 1030 on top of that. So you're looking at 52 hours and 30 minutes of pay for that green slip, that 4-day trip over the Christmas holiday.
Okay. Very good. A couple items that came in here, entry-level pilots, so new hire pay has improved.
Yep, that's right. They were paid a salary before and we all went through it. Everyone probably listened to this podcast remembers that period of time where it was pretty paltry.
When we were all poor.
Yeah. You're taking a pretty good pay cut that first year from most places people come from. So that's improved a little bit. It's nothing earth shattering, but it's definitely something better. More aligns what our new hires get with what happens in the rest of the industry.
Okay. Another one is profit sharing. You codified, there was a carve out, and this really only applies to a small segment of pilots, but it seemed that if you retired in December, then your December earnings were not included in profit sharing or something to that effect. What was the win there?
The win there. So that issue was identified by a number of our retiring pilots. But what happens is if you retire in December, of course, you've got earnings in December that, likely are going to be reflected in your paycheck. If you receive your catch-up check on the 15th of January for earnings that you made in December, whatever was on that check in January was not considered for profit sharing in that following year, like it is for everyone else. So those pilots, there was income that they made while they were in extras at Delta that never got considered for profit sharing. So we just cleaned that up. And again, this is not earth shattering, and that's a great time to mention, I guess. There's a lot of things that you're going to read in this agreement that just seem like very small or very incremental type gains. But that was the goal here is there's a lot of little paper cuts that our pilots are subject to in the current contract that we wanted to kind of smooth over. So the big home run is the aggregate value of all of this, as well as there's a few items that are pretty significant, but they do affect some of our pilots. And we just tried to clean up as many of them as we could.
Okay. Speaking of paper cuts, there's a couple that I fell victim to. So let's bring those out. And these are more in section 4, which is minimum pay and credit, but we're talking about compensation here. So the improved short call provision that a reserve pilot will now receive 1 hour of pay, no credit for the completion of each short call on top of the guarantee. I feel like pilots have been asking that for a while. And is that true?
It is true. Yeah. So the short call tables that outline how many short calls pilots are responsible for on reserve, they've got a proration effect to them. So depending on how many days you're available that month, you have vacation or if you have training or any other known absence. On the current contract, you can be assigned up to 7 short calls. You currently receive 1 hour of pay and credit for each of those 7 short calls. But because it's pay and credit, it applies towards your reserve guarantee. So effectively, unless you filled up for the month, you don't really get paid for short call right now. So we've done a couple things with short call. We have eliminated the 7th short call. So we've adjusted the proration table to show a maximum of 6 required short calls. And those are the short calls that can be given out involuntarily to pilots. Each one of those 6 short calls has now been changed to have a 1 hour of pay and no credit pay assignment to it. And so of course the pay no credit now means that it goes above your reserve guarantee for the month. Now, the one caveat there is that if you get used, you don't get that pay. And then that's consistent with the current provision we have of the pay and credit. The same thing happens there. It also, there's an example of this in the industry at United. They've got a similar provision that they get an hour of pay for each short call they do, but they do the first 2 for free. So their first 2 short calls for the month, there's no pay assignment at all. But the other thing we've done with short call is we've added the ability for pilots to have a lot more control over the short calls that they receive. And we've added a lot more transparency to the process. Now, the current system scheduling comes up with however many short call periods they want for the next day, and they just shotgun them out. And it's very opaque. Pilots don't really know when they're going to get a short call or what short call period it's going to be. We do have a yellow slip process, but you're kind of throwing darts in a dart room there because you have no idea what the short call periods are going to be when you're throwing your yellow slip in. So that's another piece of this is we've added short call transparency that says that they have to post the short calls for the next day by 8 a.m. and then award them at noon. So pilots will be able to log in after 8 a.m., see what short calls are going to be available for the next day, and adjust their yellow slips according to that. And then they have to be awarded via yellow slip within your days of availability. They're not going to give somebody who has 1 day of availability a short call that they had intended for a 4-day stretch. There's some restrictions to it, but at least you'll know what's in the hopper. Once you get past noon, there's language that prohibits them from assigning them unless it's an unforeseen operational requirement. So they can still assign short calls manually past noon, but it has to be for something that was unforeseen.
Okay. And if you get used, now this seems tricky, but if you start your short call period and you're called off of short call, that is considered getting used.
Yeah. So if you start short call and they say, hey, we have a trip for you, show up in a couple hours, then yeah, you're used and you're no longer subject to the 1 hour of pay no credit. However, you are subject to the rotation pay at that point, of which there are a number of pay features now in section 12 when we get there that may pay that pilot some pay no credit on top of their guarantee as well. So I wouldn't necessarily say they're going to lose the hour. I would say they're probably going to earn the hour in a different manner.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. I suspect reserve may go senior.
Yeah, it seems that way. I mean, between an 18-hour long call, and of course, we're encroaching in other sections here, but I've sat reserve for the vast majority of my career at Delta, commuted to most of it as well. And I'll tell you that this contract, the provisions under it, while it's not perfect, it's certainly an order of magnitude better quality of life wise for reserve pilots. And I say that as somebody who's sat a lot of reserve, understanding the way that this all fits together in this new agreement.
Yeah, agree. And I don't want to beat the short call horse, but if you were assigned a short call and then subsequently a trip and you're released from short call before you've started that period, then you haven't sat a short call. So you don't get the hour of pay on top of the guarantee. You just fly this trip. Do you think that's going to incentivize the company to just use short calls?
Potentially, but really the incentive that we were trying to create was in cases where there's really no IROP going on or there's no staffing issue going on. There's instances where the company will still put 10 or 12 pilots or 14 pilots. They'll put everybody on reserve that day on short call when there's really no practical reason for it. I remember I was based in Detroit for a period of time and you'd always see the A330 pilots in there on short call. And sometimes there'd be 8 of them when there was only 3 departures. So you just kind of scratch your head and say, well, why do we need to make these guys sit around waiting for a flight that doesn't exist? So this makes that expensive because the likelihood is that all those pilots on short call weren't going to get used. And if the company wants to continue to do that, there's nothing stopping it, but it is going to start to cost some money to them now that it had cost before.
Gotcha. And then really the last paper cut, as we'll call it here, is the minimum pay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this really helps out a reserve pilot who has been awarded a green slip that is then canceled or no opt. And if you haven't shown to the airport, you don't get the suit up pay. And I've been there before where they say, never mind. And it really became a strategy, I believe, in scheduling where they would run a number of green slips for reserve pilots. And then they'd say, never mind, we don't need you. We rerouted somebody and now you go home empty handed. But a regular pilot who is in that same boat gets single pay, no credit. So this minimum pay of 2 hours with no credit above the guarantee kind of helps you out there, right?
Yeah, you'd get the 2 hours above the guarantee. So it's a 2-hour pay no credit. And again, this is a scenario, I think you maybe hit the nail on the head here, is that I think crew scheduling knew that there really wasn't a consequence for certain green slip assignments that they knew likely were not going to actually materialize. So there's examples of that we've been made aware of where people will be called out for trips that really the company knew were not really going to actually happen, just kind of as more of an insurance plan. So this at least gives that pilot a couple hours of pay for the effort of getting suited up and getting to the airport. That it doesn't exist today. 2 hours is whatever, it's paltry, but it's more than we have today.
Yeah. And this stuff adds up. I've been in both of those boats, so appreciate it from this side. Let's move on to the big stuff. And I want to talk about retro pay and break that up into really the two discussions of a one-time retroactive payment from January 1st, 2023 through data signing, which would potentially be March 1st. So originally that was not included in the AIP. It sounds like the negotiators went back and were able to achieve that for the pilots. What is that about?
So when the company came to Raleigh that last week of November, first week of December, the offer that was made that week It improved numerous times during that week. And at the end of the week, the story's been told several times, but at the end of the week, the mediator was satisfied with the offer that the company had made. And we brought that to the MEC. Before the end of that meeting, though, with the company, the conversation was actually had about what do we do with the period of time between January 1st and whenever the ratification of this potential agreement would be. And at the time, there wasn't an interest to talk about it. So I've seen some comments that it was a mess up or it was missed. Definitely not the case. There was a conversation about it. And at that point in time, the company said they weren't interested in doing anything beyond what they had already offered. So fast forward, when that became the topic of conversation widely amongst the pilots, there was a desire to try to take another crack at solving the problem. At the time, Jason was the master chairman, and he and I went over and approached Mr. Hallenstein and Mr. Lauder and had a conversation. Said, this is a major problem. This gap in time here where our pilots are effectively taking a pay cut for a couple months to the previous one-time plus up of their earned income. And it's something that didn't have precedent. You don't normally structure an agreement this way. So we basically called out and said, we need to fix this. This is a problem. So they agreed to make the 18% pay raise effective January 1st, including all the pay table changes as well, the pay banding of all those other aircraft types up. All that comes into effect on January 1st. The other ancillary benefit is all of the pay-related items that were deferred a year, the 5% kicker raise, and then the subsequent 4%, the DC increases, those all moved up as well to January 1st. So you look at the term of the agreement, it pulls value 2 months earlier throughout the term. So it's pretty valuable. It had a certain amount of value to move the pay rates up 2 months in the first year, but the bigger change is really what it does in those out years as well by moving everything else up.
Okay. And that does include the DC payment, right? That is the essence of full retro back to January 1st of this year. And I want to ask, why wasn't that included to begin with?
Did we, in essence, have to give up anything or exchange anything for that retro payment back to January 1st, 2023?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any contract negotiation that has been successful that outstanding grievances weren't resolved. So that doesn't mean that they're dropped. It means that they're resolved. It means that there's a settlement.
It's important for pilots to understand that generally when you move into a new contract, you want a clean slate. And so there's a number of outstanding grievances that you typically settle or negotiate before you move on. And in this instance, the value of retro pay back to January 1st exceeded this bucket of grievances that we were going to pursue separate, right? So we essentially exchanged that for retro pay.
So a number of these items, there are settlements that will go along with the resolution. As far as how that tied into this whole process, grievances aren't really in the wheelhouse of the negotiating committee. They're more of an MEC administration and a contract administration function. So with regard to the negotiation that happened with the company, it was pretty high level that day with Mr. Hallenstein and Mr. Lauder, that they understood that their teams had some grievances that were pending.
Okay, thanks. And then the big nugget is retro pay going back to January 1st of 2020, unprecedented segment of timing that we've gone through. It's obviously been years since then. And so do you want to explain the current retro model that is in the TA?
Sure. Yeah. Like you said, we're kind of in uncharted territory here with the amount of time that's been since our amendable date. However, the ask to make that entire period retroactive, that is uncharted water. So what we were able to secure is, this sounds like a sound point meant to sell. It's really not that, but it's a statement of fact. That retro, when you add it all up, is in that neighborhood of $800 to $900 million. And that's double what the retro was worth under TA2. At the time of TA2, that was the single biggest retro payment that had ever been made. This doubles that and is a clear high watermark for any kind of retro pay. Now, does that mean that we got full retro back to the amendable date? That's you could line 10 pilots up and ask them, what does that mean to them? And it's going to mean something different to most of those pilots. What it does mean for us, though, is money that will be paid to us for earnings of that period. We're taking care of retirees. Anyone who took the VOP or anybody who retired is subject to the payment.
So retirees are eligible for the payment for the time during the relevant period that they were active, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We're taking care of the disabled pilots that had earnings during that period. their disability will get a one-time plus up for that period of time as well. And then the other thing that may not be obvious as part of this deal is that when that payment comes to you in March of this year, it's required to be paid within 30 days of ratification, no later than the end of March. But when that comes to you, that's going to be considered for profit sharing earnings for the 2023 year. So your profit sharing, if there is any, of course, it's anyone's guess, but if 2023 is a successful year and has profit, your earnings in that payment will be considered as active earnings for the 2023 year for profit sharing. It also is considered, if any of our pilots need to use their disability benefit, it'll be considered in their high 12 months of FAE that will establish their disability benefit going forward. So a couple little nuances that really are valuable to a lot of pilots that may not be obvious either.
And then just to be clear, if people want to do the math, you take your gross earnings in 2020, you take 4% of that. That's your payout for 2020. You do the same thing in 2021. You take 4% of that. And you do the same.
I would make, Ryan, is that the way that you get to your gross earnings is it's actually the sum total of all your time cards for active wages during that time. So some people look at their W-2 or some people look at their last pay stub. That's not exactly accurate because there's some overlap because we get paid a couple weeks in arrears. Some of your income on your pay stub for that year is actually for the year prior. It was earned in the year prior. So we've had some questions. What happens to the income that I earned in December of 2022 that I get paid for in January of 2023? The answer is that income is what's counted for part of your full year 2022 earnings. And that's what your 14% will be based on, not necessarily what's on your pay stub, but more so what earnings you earned in the calendar year. And then obviously going forward, your earnings in January of 2023 are subject to the 18% raise. We've been asked if there's a 2-month gap because of the arrears paycheck at the end of 2022. The answer is no, there's not.
Okay, that's helpful. So use your time card, figure things out. The 4, and 14% for the retro. It does not include the DC or the 401k contribution. This is just lump sum, right?
Yeah, that's correct. They'll add it all up for all those years. And then the retroactive January through the end of February, February 2023 payment is subject to DC. So you'll get the 16% on that as well, but not on the 2020, 2021, and 2022.
Right. Understood. Okay. And
let me speak to that one more point. Because of this payment and because pay rates go up in 2023 significantly more than the 401k limits do, there's a high likelihood that 75% or more of our pilots reach the 401k limits in 2023 because of this payment and because we will get some profit sharing. I think they're forecasting between 5 and 5.5%. So when you add all that up, our pilots are going to be hitting the limits in the 401k plan as well. You do have the ability to defer some of this one-time payment into your 401k if you want. So that is the one silver lining here is it gives some pilots some choice. If they want to have some of that pay for those 3 years go into their 401k, they can elect to do so. If they don't, then they don't have to, it doesn't have to go in the 401k. So that's one angle on it.
Okay, thanks. So we'll end with the retro discussion here. And I think everybody's thinking it and everybody's asking it. And that is generally we want this retroactive payment to be a barrier, to be a preventative measure for the company to drag out negotiations in the future. How does this stack with that? How does this prevent it in the future? And how do you sit with that?
Well, TA2, we did get 11 months of retro, which were full retro. Of course, that was all constrained in a single calendar year, which made it a much easier size. But the reality is I don't feel like that had any impact on the timeline of this negotiation. So whether it's going to impact in the future, whether we've set a precedent, I've heard all those arguments. I guess I'm not convinced one way or the other that it will or won't. I do know that writing an $800 or $900 million check is not a fun thing for the company to do. So I don't think they look at it like this was some massive win. And I say that earnestly. I do not think that they're looking at this like it was a win for them. I think it's beyond anything they imagine they'd have to do to close this deal.
Okay. Thanks for answering that candidly. I appreciate it, Eric.
Well, we certainly covered a lot in compensation. Eric Criswell, the negotiating committee chairman, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
On the next episode, we're going to talk Section 5 lodging and expenses. That'll cover per diem, crew meal, and hotel improvements. This has been Engaged, the podcast for Delta pilots. Thanks for listening. My name is Ryan Argenta. Stay safe and keep the rubber on the road.
You're listening to Engage, the podcast for Delta pilots. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform, and receive notifications when a new episode is available.